March 9, 1945. Tokyo, 11:30 p.m. Air raid sirens wail across Japan's capital. Citizens scramble for shelters they've practiced reaching dozens of times. But tonight is different. The B-29 Superfortresses approaching aren't carrying the usual high-explosive bombs. They're carrying fire. 334 bombers, the largest formation of the war, cross Tokyo's coastline at staggered altitudes between 4,900 and 9,200 feet, much lower than usual, stripped of defensive guns to carry more payload. Each bomber loaded with M69 incendiaries designed specifically to burn Japanese cities. The lead pathfinders drop napalm-filled bombs to mark targets and start fires. The main force follows, dropping incendiaries at half the normal interval for maximum concentration. Each bombardier aims individually at the edges of spreading flames, expanding the conflagration with every bomb run. Within minutes, individual fires merge into a firestorm. Flames reach hundreds of feet high. Heat becomes so intense that water in shallow canals literally boils. People trying to run through flames to escape fall in the superheated air and die where they collapse. The congested wooden construction of Tokyo's residential and industrial districts burns like kindling, spreading fire faster than anyone can run. By dawn, 16 square miles of Tokyo are smoking ruins. More than 100,000 civilians are dead, more than either atomic bomb would kill. 1 million people are homeless. Japan's largest city is a crematory. Radio Tokyo calls it slaughter bombing and compares the destruction to Nero's Rome. But the comparison is wrong. The damage to Tokyo is far worse. And this is just the beginning. Subscribe to see how the B-29 Superfortress burned Japan into submission before the atomic bombs fell, and leave a comment with where you're watching from. March 10th, 1945. Curtis LeMay, commanding 21st Bomber Command, studies reconnaissance photos of Tokyo. His tactical gamble, low-altitude night attacks with incendiaries, worked beyond expectations. 14 B-29s lost, but the destruction is catastrophic. More importantly, Japanese resolve is crumbling. 2 days later, 313 B-29s hit Nagoya. Then, 301 bombers attack Osaka, wiping out 8 square miles of the city's commercial and industrial heart. LeMay flies 5 major firebombing missions in 10 days, systematically destroying Japan's urban industrial base. By June 1945, Japan's 6 largest cities are burned ruins. Industrial production has collapsed, food distribution has failed, more than 1 million Japanese casualties, hundreds of thousands dead. American intelligence reports that 70% of Japanese civilians surveyed have reached the point where they cannot endure one more day of war. The atomic bombs dropped in August get credit for ending the war. But Japan was already on its knees. The B-29 firebombing campaign had broken the country's will and capacity to fight. The atomic weapons simply provided political cover for surrender that military and civilian leaders already knew was necessary. This is the story of how 50,000 tons of incendiaries accomplished what conventional warfare couldn't, forcing an entire nation into submission through systematic destruction from above. The story most Americans don't know because it's buried beneath the atomic bomb narrative. The story of how Curtis LeMay burned Japan into surrender 3 months before Hiroshima. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was designed to bomb Nazi Germany. By the time production began in mid-1943, it became clear that its extraordinary range, 3,250 miles, was no longer necessary for the European theater. But that range was perfect for the vast Pacific, where targets in Japan sat thousands of miles from potential Allied bases. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces, saw the B-29 as his chance for independent combat command. Instead of assigning the bombers to existing theater commanders like Douglas MacArthur or George Kenney, Arnold created the 20th Air Force, a strategic bombing command controlled directly from Washington. Arnold's staff would select targets and command operations from thousands of miles away. The decision was partly political. President Franklin Roosevelt, running for an unprecedented third term in 1944, wanted to commence bombing of Japan as soon as possible. Early attacks on Japan would boost his political standing. The B-29 made this possible. But where to base them? Soviet Siberia was off-limits due to Soviet neutrality with Japan. The Aleutians had range but horrific weather. The Mariana Islands were ideal, but wouldn't be captured until mid-1944. That left China, barely within range, logistically nightmarish, but immediately available. Operation Matterhorn called for B-29s to operate from bases near Calcutta, India, with forward staging bases around Chengdu, China. All supplies had to be flown over the hump, the Himalayas, making it the most logistically complex bombing campaign ever attempted. B-29s would haul their own fuel and bombs to Chinese bases before flying missions against Japan. The first B-29s arrived in India in March 1944. By June, they were ready for combat. The first mission hit railroad yards in Bangkok. 98 B-29s took off, but confusion, weather, and mechanical problems reduced effectiveness. 5 brand-new bombers were lost. 17 crewmen died. Damage to the target was minimal. 20th Air Force called it a success anyway. The real objective was Japan itself. On June 15, 1944, the day Americans invaded Saipan, 47 B-29s attacked the Imperial Steel Works at Yawata on Kyushu. It was the first attack on Japan since the Doolittle raid 2 years earlier. The strike did negligible damage, but the psychological impact was enormous. Japanese civilians realized for the first time that they were in danger. Their cities weren't untouchable sanctuaries. Missions continued through summer and fall 1944, but results were poor. Weather over Japan was terrible. Logistics were impossible. The jet stream, unknown to American planners, created 200-mile-per-hour headwinds that scattered formations and made accurate bombing impossible. Matterhorn operations managed to annoy Japan, but couldn't inflict serious damage. Meanwhile, American forces captured Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in the Marianas. These islands sat 1,500 miles from Tokyo, perfect B-29 range, and they didn't require flying supplies over the Himalayas. The Marianas would become the primary base for the war's final bombing campaign. Brigadier General Haywood Hansell arrived on Saipan in October 1944 to command 21st Bomber Command. Hansell was a precision bombing advocate who believed in high-altitude daylight attacks against specific industrial targets, the doctrine developed in Europe against Germany. He planned to systematically destroy Japan's aircraft industry, then its other war industries, preparing the home islands for invasion. The first major strike from Saipan hit the Nakajima aircraft engine plant at Musashino near Tokyo on November 24, 1944. Of 111 B-29s that took off, only 24 actually bombed the target. Weather and the jet stream scattered the formation. Results were minimal. Subsequent missions through December and January produced similar disappointing results. Weather over Japan was consistently terrible. The jet stream winds, sometimes exceeding 200 miles per hour, made formation flying nearly impossible and scattered bombs across miles. High-altitude precision bombing wasn't working. Arnold and his staff in Washington grew impatient. They pushed for experimental incendiary attacks. On December 18, 1944, 84 B-29s joined other aircraft in an incendiary attack on the Japanese supply depot at Hankow, China. The results were spectacular. 40 to 50% of the target destroyed by just 38% of the bombs dropped. The mission proved incendiaries were devastatingly effective against Japanese construction. Hansel resisted the shift to area bombing with incendiaries. He believed precision attacks on industry would work if given time. But time was something Washington wouldn't give him. In January 1945, he was relieved. Curtis LeMay, commander of the 22nd Bomber Command in China, was brought to Saipan to replace him. LeMay was a pragmatist. If precision bombing wasn't working, he'd try something else. Curtis LeMay took command of 21st Bomber Command on Saipan in January 1945, facing crisis. His B-29s were burning through fuel and bombs attacking Japan with minimal results. Precision bombing at high altitude wasn't working. The jet stream scattered formations. Weather obscured targets. Japanese industry continued functioning. Washington wanted results. Arnold's 20th Air Force staff pushed for incendiary attacks against urban areas. The moral calculus had shifted. Japanese announcements that all men to age 60 and women to age 45 were mobilized for homeland defense provided justification for treating cities as military targets. If Japan's entire population was part of the war effort, then Japan's cities were legitimate targets. LeMay initially continued Hansel's approach, but results didn't improve. On February 25th, he launched a massive incendiary raid against Tokyo with 172 B-29s, dropping 453 tons of incendiaries from high altitude. Clouds forced radar bombing, but the fires destroyed about 1 square mile and killed thousands. The attack proved incendiaries worked, but LeMay knew he could do better. He decided to revolutionize American bombing tactics. Future missions would be flown at night, at much lower altitudes, between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, instead of 25,000 to 30,000 feet. This decision shocked his staff. Flying low put bombers within range of anti-aircraft fire and eliminated the advantage of altitude. But LeMay reasoned that Japanese anti-aircraft defenses were poorly organized. Their radar was inferior, and their guns were less accurate than German weapons. More controversially, LeMay ordered bombers stripped of most defensive armament, the heavy machine guns and ammunition that consumed weight and space. Japanese night fighters weren't effective enough to justify the defensive guns. Removing them allowed each B-29 to carry 3,000 additional pounds of incendiaries. The tactical plan was sophisticated. Lead Pathfinder aircraft would mark targets with napalm bombs, creating fires visible from miles away. The main force would follow at staggered altitudes, each bombardier dropping individually at the edges of spreading flames to maximize the burning area. M69 incendiaries would be dropped at 50-foot intervals instead of the normal 100 feet, creating devastating concentration. The target was Tokyo, specifically the congested residential and light industrial districts, where construction was overwhelmingly wood and paper. Japanese cities were fundamentally different from European cities. Densely packed wooden structures with narrow streets. No stone buildings or wide boulevards to act as fire breaks. Perfect fuel for sustained conflagration. March 9, 1945. The mission launched at dusk. 334 B-29s, the largest formation yet. It took 3 hours for all aircraft to become airborne. The bombers flew individually to Japan rather than forming up, reducing fuel consumption and allowing each crew to find optimal altitude for the jet stream. The Pathfinders arrived over Tokyo shortly before midnight. Weather was clear. The lead crews dropped their napalm markers precisely on target. Fires erupted immediately, spreading quickly through the wooden structures. The main force followed. Bombardiers aimed at the edges of visible flames, dropping M69 incendiaries that burst at 2,000 feet, scattering dozens of smaller bomblets that ignited on contact. Each bomber dropped 7 tons of incendiaries. Within minutes, individual fires merged into a massive conflagration. The increasing wind, reaching 30 miles per hour, fanned the flames into a firestorm. Temperatures exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The fire created its own weather system, generating winds that pulled burning debris into the sky, then scattered it across wider areas, starting new fires. The fire spread outward from the initial impact zone at speeds approaching 100 feet per minute. Citizens attempting to flee found escape routes blocked by walls of flame. Thousands crowded into canals and rivers seeking refuge in water. But the heat was so intense that water in shallow areas boiled. Those who couldn't fully submerge died from heat exposure or smoke inhalation. People running through streets fell unconscious from superheated air entering their lungs and died where they collapsed. The B-29 crews witnessed the catastrophe from above. Smoke rose to 20,000 feet. The smell of burning flesh reached aircraft at 6,000 feet. Turbulence from the heat tossed bombers around like toys. Some crewmen vomited from the stench. Others wept. But they kept bombing. The fires burned until dawn. When reconnaissance aircraft surveyed the damage the next day, 16 square miles of Tokyo, roughly 25% of the city, had been incinerated. Post-war analysis determined that approximately 100,000 people died that night, more casualties than either atomic bomb would inflict. 1 million people were left homeless. 22 industrial targets and thousands of small feeder plants were destroyed. 14 B-29s were lost. 42 crewmen killed. The loss rate was actually lower than previous high-altitude missions. LeMay's gamble had succeeded tactically. Going in low had worked. But the moral implications were staggering. American bombers had just deliberately killed 100,000 civilians in a single night. Radio Tokyo called it slaughter bombing. Japanese propaganda compared it to the worst atrocities in history. They weren't entirely wrong. LeMay's response was pragmatic. I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal. He wasn't apologizing. He was stating reality. The firebombing campaign would save American lives by forcing Japanese surrender without invasion. The moral calculus justified the means. 2 days later, 313 B-29s hit Nagoya. Then 301 bombers attacked Osaka, destroying 8 square miles. LeMay launched 5 major firebombing raids in 10 days, systematically burning Japan's largest cities. The pattern was established: overwhelming force, low-altitude incendiary attack, maximum destruction. Japan's resolve began crumbling. Civilian morale plummeted. The peace movement within the government gained strength. People who had been willing to fight to defend the homeland began questioning whether resistance was worth continued annihilation from the sky. LeMay believed he could force Japan to surrender through bombing alone, no invasion necessary. He wrote to Washington expressing this belief. Other high-ranking officers, including MacArthur and former ambassador to Japan, Joseph Grew, agreed. Japan was breaking. By June 1945, Curtis LeMay commanded sufficient resources to mount raids exceeding 500 B-29s. Japan's 6 largest cities were burning ruins. The systematic destruction of urban industrial areas had devastated Japanese capacity to continue the war. The numbers were staggering. More than 50,000 tons of incendiaries dropped on Japanese cities. Over 178 square miles burned, an area larger than Manhattan. Industrial production collapsed. Food distribution failed. Transportation networks ceased functioning. More than 1 million Japanese casualties, with hundreds of thousands dead. The psychological impact exceeded the physical destruction. Japanese civilians who'd believed their homeland was invincible now watched American bombers appear overhead with impunity, day and night, burning cities at will. Air raid sirens became constant background noise. Shelters couldn't protect against firestorms. Evacuation was impossible when every city was targeted. American intelligence conducted surveys after the surrender. 70% of Japanese civilians interviewed reported they'd reached the point where they could not endure another day of war. Many cited the bombing campaign specifically as the reason they supported surrender. The atomic bombs, dropped in August, simply confirmed what they already knew. Continued resistance meant annihilation. LeMay's urban bombing campaign had 3 phases. Phase 1, completed by June 15th, destroyed the 6 largest cities. Phase 2 targeted secondary industrial cities. By July, American bombers had run out of major targets. Phase 3 began dropping leaflets warning specific cities they would be attacked next, allowing civilians to evacuate. Psychological warfare designed to further demoralize the population and disrupt what remained of Japanese industry. The capture of Iwo Jima in March provided an emergency landing field for damaged B-29s returning from Japan. More than 2,400 emergency landings were made at Iwo, saving roughly 27,000 American airmen's lives. The island also based P-51 Mustang fighters that could escort B-29s all the way to Japan, further reducing bomber losses. By July, the bombing campaign included not just B-29s, but also B-24 Liberators from Okinawa, Navy carrier aircraft, and P-51 fighters flying ground attack missions. Japan was subjected to the most intense aerial bombardment in history. More tonnage dropped on Japan in 1945 than Germany received during the entire European war. Japanese military and civilian leaders recognized the war was lost. Multiple factions within the government advocated surrender. The primary obstacle was agreeing on terms that would preserve the emperor and avoid treating the entire government as war criminals. These weren't unreasonable concerns, but they delayed surrender, while American bombs continued falling. President Truman issued the Potsdam Declaration on July 26th, calling for unconditional surrender. Many Japanese leaders wanted to accept, but hardliners in the military cabinet objected. The bombing continued. On August 6th, the first atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima. 3 days later, the second destroyed Nagasaki. Popular American mythology credits these weapons with forcing Japanese surrender. The reality was more complex. The atomic bombs killed roughly 200,000 people total, a terrible number, but comparable to casualties from the Tokyo firebombing alone. More importantly, Japanese decision-makers in Tokyo didn't fully understand what had happened. Communication from Hiroshima was disrupted. Initial reports suggested a massive conventional raid. By the time they understood a single bomb had destroyed an entire city, the second bomb had fallen on Nagasaki. What the atomic bombs provided was political cover. The Emperor and Peace faction could argue that Japan faced a new weapon against which there was no defense, making continued resistance futile. This argument allowed them to overcome military hardliners who opposed surrender under any circumstances. But Japan was already beaten. The firebombing campaign had destroyed the country's capacity to wage war. Industrial production had effectively ceased. Food supplies were critically low. Civilian morale had collapsed. Military intelligence estimated that white flags were being waved across Kyushu by early August, civilians giving up before invasion even began. On August 14th, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people for the first time in history via radio broadcast. He announced Japan's surrender, citing the devastating new atomic weapons, but also acknowledging that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. A masterpiece of understatement. Japan's cities were smoking ruins, its people were starving, its military was shattered. The B-29s flew their final mission on August 14th, a massive strike involving over 1,000 aircraft hitting targets across Japan. When the Emperor's broadcast was confirmed, the bombers already airborne were recalled. The war was over. September 2nd, 1945. Japanese officials stood on the deck of USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, signing surrender documents. Above them, a massive formation of B-29 Superfortresses flew low over the bay, a final reminder of the terrible destruction that had brought Japan to this moment. Curtis LeMay's firebombing campaign had burned 67 Japanese cities. The systematic destruction had killed between 300,000 and 900,000 civilians. Estimates vary widely. Material damage was catastrophic. 2.5 million buildings destroyed, 8.5 million people left homeless. Japan's industrial capacity reduced to roughly 30% of pre-war levels. The atomic bombs get credit for ending the war in popular memory. But the B-29 incendiary campaign had already broken Japan. The atomic weapons simply provided the political justification for surrender that military and civilian leaders already knew was necessary. LeMay never apologized for the firebombing campaign. He believed it saved American lives by making invasion unnecessary. Post-war estimates suggested that invading Japan would have cost 500,000 to 1 million American casualties. If the choice was between burning Japanese cities and sacrificing hundreds of thousands of American soldiers, LeMay had no doubt which option was correct. The moral questions remain. Were the firebombing attacks justified as military necessity? Were they war crimes comparable to German and Japanese atrocities? Can the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians be balanced against military objectives and saved American lives? These questions don't have simple answers. What's clear is that the B-29 Superfortress, designed to bomb Germany but deployed against Japan, became the weapon that brought the Empire of Japan to its knees, not through precision strikes on military targets, through systematic destruction of cities and deliberate targeting of civilian populations. The atomic bombs ended the war, but the B-29 firebombing campaign won it. By the time Fat Man fell on Nagasaki, Japan was already defeated. The Emperor's surrender broadcast confirmed what Curtis LeMay's bombers had accomplished in 5 months of burning Japanese cities, the complete destruction of Japan's capacity and will to continue fighting. 50,000 tons of incendiaries, 67 cities burned, hundreds of thousands of civilians killed. Japan bombed into submission before the atomic age began. That's the story most Americans don't know because it's uncomfortable and overshadowed by nuclear weapons. But it's history. And understanding it matters for understanding how World War II actually ended and what we're willing to do to win wars.